I pulled into the Green Oak Marina Club, the place my family had treasured for as long as I could remember. It was beautiful, the harbor shimmering under the midday sun, but today it felt like a museum, a memory of something long gone. It was my great Aunt Liz's 75th birthday brunch, and though I hadn't seen most of my relatives in years, I could already feel their eyes on me, judging from the second I stepped inside. The club was packed, but I chose a small table by the glass wall, away from the big crowd. I wasn't in the mood for the noise, the fake pleasantries, the way they'd look at me like I was a stranger. As I sat, I caught a glimpse of my cousin Mark. His eyes widened when he spotted me, not in a welcoming way, but more like he was trying to figure out why I even bothered showing up. "Wow, you made it," he said, eyebrows high. Like it was a surprise I wasn't still holed up somewhere, working on my quirky tech things, as they all like to call it. I forced a smile, nodded, and looked out at the water. The brunch started with the usual polite jabs about my career. They asked if I was still figuring it out or chasing the next thing. Aunt Liz didn't even hide her smirk as she commented on my odd jobs in tech. No one cared that I'd turned that odd job into a thriving company. They all acted like I was still in my 20s, just playing around. And of course, they scoffed at my lack of visible wealth. They couldn't understand why I didn't drive a flashy car or have a big house. They couldn't see how much I was doing, how much I had built. And it pissed me off, but I wasn't about to give them the satisfaction of knowing that. So I sat there, nursing my mimosa, listening to them talk about their renovations, their cruises, their charity work, all of it just ways to feel better about the fact that the Marina Club, this place they held on to, like it was their legacy, was slowly slipping away. I thought about how, just a few months ago, I'd quietly bought it, through my business group, no fuss, just a good deal. And then, as if to rub it in, Mark proudly announced that he and his wife were looking at Chandler Point Estate, the old place that had been sitting on the market for years. "Yeah," he said all cocky, "we're making an offer this week." I didn't say a word, just let it sit there. They had no idea that I'd already bought it, all cash, and I'd closed the deal just last week. I wasn't about to spoil his moment. I didn't say anything about Chandler Point Estate. I just let Mark rattle on, the way he always did when he was talking about his latest big thing. I wasn't going to interrupt him, let him think what he wanted. Aunt Liz, though, couldn't resist. "So, how's that tech career going?" she asked, her voice dripping with that polite condescension she always reserved for me. "Still working those odd jobs?" I swallowed a sigh and kept my smile tight. "It's going fine, Aunt Liz. Thanks for asking." Cousin Rachel chimed in, leaning forward with that same fake curiosity. "Are you still living out of a suitcase, or have you finally found a home?" I felt my stomach tighten, but I didn't give them the satisfaction of knowing it bothered me. "I have a place," I said, the words simple and flat. I didn't owe them any more than that. They just nodded, clearly satisfied with my bare bones answers. I kept my gaze on the window, staring at the marina beyond. The way the boat swayed gently in the water, the sun glinting off the ripples. It was a pretty view, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was just a spectator, not really part of this world anymore. I used to be. I used to sit here, listen to the same conversations, sip the same mimosas, and pretend I cared. But now, I saw it for what it was. A game. A game they were still playing. A game I'd already won. The conversation swirled around me. The renovations at Mark and Rachel's house. Their last trip to Italy. Aunt Liz's latest charity gala. The club was their prize, their status symbol. They talked about it like it was some great family treasure, passed down through the generations, a place to be proud of. I'd heard them all claim ownership over it in one way or another, as if it wasn't just a building or a piece of property, but some ancient family heirloom that belonged to them by right. It was almost laughable. I thought about the quiet deal I'd made, the contracts, the lowball offer I'd swooped in on, how I had come in and bought the entire marina without them even realizing it. Not a whisper, not a peep. My business group had moved quickly, and now it was mine. Every inch of it. The docks, the restaurant, the real estate, all of it. They'd never know what hit them. Mark kept talking, this time about some big decision he was making with his wife. The Chandler Point estate. He was so proud of himself, so sure he was about to score big. "We're going to make an offer," he said with that smug grin. "It's been on the market forever. Looks like it's finally going to be ours." I didn't say anything. Didn't even flinch. I already knew he was wasting his time. I knew because I'd closed the deal last week. All cash, no loan, no drama. I'd signed the paperwork, then left them to chase their tails, thinking they still had a shot. Mark didn't know that. None of them did. And I wasn't about to spoil his little fantasy. Not yet. I could feel Aunt Liz's eyes on me, waiting for me to respond, but I just stayed quiet. It wasn't worth it. Let them keep living in their bubble. Let them keep thinking their money meant something. But deep down, I knew what they didn't. I was the one who had outplayed them all, and they didn't even realize it yet. I excused myself from the table, needing a break from the endless chatter. I could feel their eyes on me as I made my way across the room, but I kept my head down. The last thing I wanted was to get caught up in another round of fake smiles or thinly veiled insults. The powder room was quiet, a little too quiet, and the moment I stepped inside, I heard their voices, Aunt Liz's and Rachel's, right on the other side of the door. God, I swear she probably only came for the free food, Rachel's voice said, loud enough for me to hear clearly. I froze, fingers still on the doorknob, as my heart rate picked up. It was as if I had stepped into a trap they'd set up without even realizing it. She probably can't afford a nice place, Aunt Liz added, her tone dripping with that familiar dismissive edge. I bet that company of hers is just a hobby. I could feel my blood start to boil, but I kept still, listening. It wasn't easy, but I had learned over the years that silence was sometimes more powerful than a quick retort. She's never going to settle down. No husband, no kids, no real life, Rachel continued, giggling. I inhaled deeply, my jaw tight. This was the part that always stung. Their idea of a real life had always been wrapped up in marriages, kids, and the kind of wealth they could flaunt. Anything that didn't fit that mold was somehow less than. I let them keep talking for a moment, letting the words sink in, before I pushed the door open. Funny, isn't it? I said, my voice cool, calm. How easily you forget that I can hear everything. They both froze. Aunt Liz's face turned ashen, and Rachel's hand shot to her mouth. It was like I had slapped them both with the truth, and they weren't sure how to react. What? What did you hear? Rachel stammered, her voice suddenly small. The smugness from earlier had vanished completely. Oh, everything, I said, stepping fully into the room. The free food, the pity, the hobby comment. You were right about one thing, though. I don't have a real life by your standards, but I don't need one to be successful. I let that hang in the air for a moment, savoring the discomfort on their faces. Rachel fumbled, trying to backpedal. Oh, come on, it was just a joke, you know that, right? I didn't even look at her. I didn't need to. It wasn't funny. Without waiting for them to say anything else, I turned and walked out of the powder room, leaving the door to swing shut behind me. I returned to the table, my face a perfect mask of politeness, like nothing had happened. But I could feel their eyes on me. Rachel's unsure, Aunt Liz's full of silent fury. Their smiles faltered just for a second, before they quickly straightened up and went back to the conversation. But I knew they wouldn't be able to forget what had just happened. Neither of them had expected me to call them out. And that moment, that small shift, was enough. They'd feel it. Every time they looked at me now. I sat back down at the table, trying not to let the tension from the powder room linger too much. Aunt Liz was the first to speak, her voice smooth, like she was trying to reset the mood. So, tell us about your travels, she said, her sharp eyes never leaving me. You've been to some interesting places, haven't you? I took a sip of my drink, careful not to let my face show too much. Yeah, a few places. Frankfurt for a project last month. Jakarta the month before that. I kept it light, casual. They didn't need to know the details. Mark's eyes narrowed slightly, his interest piqued now that he could sense there was more to the story. Jakarta? He asked. What's in Jakarta? I thought you were just doing those freelance things, tech stuff. I caught myself before I could say too much, but I couldn't help slipping up. Well, we're expanding. Coastline Integration Group is growing quickly. Mark blinked, his eyebrows raised high, clearly confused. Wait, you said we. He sat back, eyes squinting like he was trying to put the pieces together. I thought you were just freelancing. You're actually running a company? I didn't hesitate. I am. Coastline Integration Group is my company. Rachel's fork paused halfway to her mouth, and I saw Aunt Liz's lips twitch in a way that told me she wasn't sure whether to hide her surprise or fake disinterest. But Mark's expression was the one I focused on. That look of disbelief, like he was trying to understand how I went from the weird cousin doing odd jobs to this. Before he could say anything else, the manager of the Marina Club walked up to the table. He was a tall guy, always professional, and I could see my relatives glance at him, wondering what he was doing here. Ms. Rains, he said, addressing me directly, the quarterly revenue statements you requested are in your office. I've also scheduled a walkthrough for the renovations tomorrow at noon, as per your instructions. There was a beat of silence. I could feel every eye on me, the whole table frozen. My great aunt's face was tight with confusion. Mark was blinking, and even Rachel looked a little pale. I nodded at the manager, forcing a polite smile. Thanks. I'll take a look at the statements later and confirm the walkthrough. Appreciate it. He gave a quick nod and left, but the moment he walked away, the atmosphere at the table shifted. I could practically hear their minds scrambling to process what had just happened. Their faces were blank, but I knew they were all thinking the same thing. Since when did she have an office? The irony wasn't lost on me. They'd spent the whole brunch treating my career like a joke, assuming I was still floating through life with no real plan. And now, here was this manager, who worked for me, just casually delivering business details. The club they'd always adored, the club that had been their family's legacy, was now part of the real work I was doing. They just didn't know the half of it yet. Mark recovered first. Wait, he said slowly, looking at me like I'd just told him I had an entire fleet of private jets. What kind of company are you running exactly? I didn't sugarcoat it. A tech company. We handle logistics, cloud infrastructure, things like that for industries like manufacturing and shipping. Rachel's voice shook a little when she spoke, but she tried to keep it light. So you're like a big deal now? I met her gaze, my tone flat. I've been doing this for a while. It just doesn't look flashy. Aunt Liz took a slow sip of her wine, trying to seem casual but not quite pulling it off. She finally spoke up. So, what's the deal with the club? Why are you involved with the marina? I didn't need to answer that. They could figure it out eventually. Instead, I just smiled and said, oh, just a little project I'm overseeing. Like I said, we're expanding. And I could see the shift, the subtle but unmistakable change in their eyes. The respect they didn't even know they'd been withholding started to seep in. Their judgments had cracked, and the tiniest crack was enough. Mark leaned forward, suddenly serious, breaking the silence that had settled over the table. So, why are you reviewing financials for the club? I mean, it's not exactly your business, right? The question hung in the air for a moment, and I could feel the eyes of the table shift back to me, the weight of their curiosity thickening the atmosphere. I didn't flinch. It was time. Time to stop playing the quiet game. I set my glass down slowly, my gaze locking with Mark's, and said simply, because I bought it last year. There was a beat of stunned silence, then someone choked on their drink. The sound cut through the tension like a knife. Aunt Liz blinked, and Rachel's fork paused midair. Mark's jaw dropped, and for a second, no one said a word. They were all just staring at me, processing the words as if they couldn't quite make sense of them. I let the silence stretch, letting the words settle. Finally, Mark cleared his throat. Wait, what? You bought the whole club? His voice was thick with disbelief. I nodded, taking another sip of my drink. Yeah, the whole thing. Docks, real estate, restaurant, everything. I saw the realization hit them, each of them taking a moment to process. Aunt Liz's face turned pale, and I could hear her breath catch in her throat. She whispered, her voice shaking a little. All this? She waved her hand across the room, as if she could encompass the entire club in one gesture. Yeah, I said, leaning back slightly, feeling the weight of the moment. It was undervalued, and it fit perfectly with Coastline Integration's hospitality division. I made the deal last year. Aunt Liz's face went through several emotions in the span of a few seconds. Confusion, surprise, and then, for the briefest moment, delight. Her eyes sparkled, and suddenly she burst into laughter. Well, I'll be damned, she said, throwing her head back. I knew you were up to something, but this? She laughed again, almost in disbelief. This is brilliant. There was a shift around the table. I could see Rachel's face turning an odd shade of red, her eyes darting toward Aunt Liz. But it was Mark who couldn't hide his frustration. His hands clenched around his fork, and he pushed his plate aside. You bought it? All of it? His voice was tight. his earlier smugness crumbling into something else. How did you even, I mean, why didn't you tell anyone? I shrugged, a casual motion, but my eyes were steady. Because it wasn't anyone's business. I didn't need to prove anything. Aunt Liz let out a short, joyful laugh again, looking at me like I had just played a perfect hand in a game she thought she knew too well. Well, you certainly kept that a secret, didn't you? She looked around at the others, as if inviting them to share in the joke. I've been watching you all try to guess what she was up to, and here she is, owning the whole damn marina club. Mark's face twisted with frustration. But why this place? Why not something else? Why here? Because it makes sense for the company, I explained, my voice a little more firm now. The location, the assets, it's perfect for expansion. It's a business opportunity, not some sentimental play. I leaned forward slightly, letting my words land. And frankly, it's a hell of a lot better than sitting around waiting for the next big thing to fall into my lap like you all seem to be. Aunt Liz, still grinning like a cat who had caught the canary, looked across the table at the others. Mark, Rachel, do you remember when you were all talking about getting this place? How many of you tried to make it work? How many of you actually even knew the value here? And now look who's sitting at the head of it all. She gave me a wink. I've always suspected she had more up her sleeve than anyone realized. Mark didn't respond, just stared at me, his face a mix of disbelief and resentment. Rachel, on the other hand, had gone completely quiet. She kept shifting in her seat, clearly uncomfortable with the shift in the conversation. I didn't offer any more details. They didn't need to know the full picture yet. The fact that I was here, in this moment, owning this place, that was enough for now. As Aunt Liz continued to chuckle, I noticed her demeanor had completely changed. She wasn't just amused, she was proud, genuinely delighted by the twist in the story. It was the first time in ages I had seen her look at me with something that resembled admiration. And in that moment, it felt damn good. She raised her glass, eyes twinkling, and said, "Well, well, well. Looks like we've all been underestimating you, my dear." I smiled and clinked my glass with hers. Guess so. The silence that followed wasn't uncomfortable anymore. It was charged. Like everyone at the table had suddenly realized I wasn't the lost family member they thought I was. I wasn't the one still trying to figure it out. I was the one who had already figured it out and was now calling the shots. The room shifted. The energy in the air thickening like a storm was coming. Mark, still processing what I'd said, wasn't about to let it go. He leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Wait a minute," he said, his voice sharp. "You really bought Chandler Point, didn't you? You already closed on it before we even got the financing in place." I met his gaze. "Yeah, that's right." He stared at me for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the reality of it. I I thought we were making the offer. We were still negotiating." I leaned back in my chair, keeping my tone casual, almost bored. "Well, I wasn't waiting around. I closed it with a wire transfer. No loans, no conditions. It was a clean deal." I looked around the table, letting the words sink in. It's what happens when you move fast. Mark's face reddened, and I could practically hear his teeth grinding. He'd been talking about Chandler Point all lunch, telling everyone how he was going to snag it. Now? Now he was the one who had been left behind. He slammed his fist on the table, the noise making everyone at the table jump. "You let me talk about it this whole damn time? I was just sitting here, acting like I was about to close the deal, and you already had it?" I didn't flinch. I just nodded, my voice even. Nobody asked what I was working on. That hit harder than anything. You could feel it in the air, like it was a slap no one wanted to admit they'd just taken. Mark opened his mouth, trying to find something to say, but nothing came out. His expression twisted into frustration, his fingers clenching around his glass like he was going to crush it. Aunt Liz, who had been riding this wave of amusement with me earlier, went silent. It wasn't just shock anymore, it was recognition. She looked between Mark and me, her gaze calculating. The earlier mockery she'd so easily thrown at me had faded, and in its place, there was something different. I couldn't tell if it was respect or just the first seeds of regret. Either way, I could feel her eyes on me, sharper than before. Rachel, on the other hand, was completely quiet now. Her fork was abandoned, forgotten beside her plate. She shifted in her seat, her gaze flicking from me to Aunt Liz, and then back to Mark, unsure what to make of all of it. She had been one of the first to mock me, to treat my work like some half-baked experiment, but now I wasn't the one who looked foolish. It was clear she was reevaluating everything she thought she knew about me. I wasn't going to let them sit in that discomfort forever, though. I wasn't here to make them feel bad. I wasn't interested in that. I just wanted them to understand that I was done being underestimated. Look, Mark, I said, voice steady but firm. I didn't need to tell anyone what I was doing. I don't need to announce every move I make. The work speaks for itself. He opened his mouth again, but I didn't let him interrupt. You all have had the luxury of taking your time, making deals over cocktails and charity galas, but I don't have that luxury. I move fast and I make it count. Mark looked like he was going to argue, but he couldn't find the words. Aunt Liz had gone unnervingly quiet, but there was an edge to her silence that hadn't been there before. She wasn't amused anymore. She was thinking, calculating, trying to figure out how this shift had happened so quickly. She had no answers, and neither did anyone else at the table. Finally, after a long moment, Aunt Liz cleared her throat, breaking the tension. Well, she said, her voice different now, quieter. Looks like we've all been a little wrong about you. Rachel glanced at me, her lips tight. She opened her mouth, but the apology she had on the tip of her tongue never quite made it out. Instead, she looked down at her plate, letting the silence stretch between us. I didn't need her apology anyway. I wasn't interested in it. I just wanted to make sure they saw me, really saw me for the first time. I could feel the balance of power at the table shift. Slowly, quietly, but definitely. The weight of their earlier assumptions about me, the ones that had been so easy to make, so simple to discard me into a box labeled confused or underachiever, those were crumbling, piece by piece. But none of them were saying anything more. They couldn't. I had outpaced them, not just in money, but in business savvy. And they didn't know how to respond to that. The quiet realization that I had gotten ahead without them, without anyone even noticing, had already settled in. I wasn't going to make them feel better about it. This wasn't about them. It was about me. And I was done pretending I didn't know exactly what I was doing. I sat back in my chair and looked out at the water. The quiet hum of the marina, the boats gently swaying in the breeze, was the only thing that made any sense right now. Aunt Liz broke the silence, but her voice had changed, soft and probing instead of sharp. I've been meaning to ask you, and maybe it's none of my business, but why do you drive that regular car and live in a 2-bedroom apartment? I felt a flash of irritation, but I kept my face neutral. It was the same questions they always asked, the ones that made it clear they couldn't understand the way I lived. I travel a lot, I said, keeping my tone steady. I don't need a big house or fancy car when I'm barely home. I looked at Aunt Liz, meeting her gaze. And I'd rather invest my money in things that matter, like my company, than blow it on things I don't need to impress people. The table went quiet again. Mark and Rachel were both still processing, and Aunt Liz didn't push further. But the look on her face told me she was thinking it over. I didn't expect her to understand, but I wasn't here to explain myself to them anymore. Rachel cleared her throat, glancing at me with a strange expression. It took a second before she spoke. I think I misjudged you, she said, her voice quieter now, almost apologetic. I'm sorry for what I said before. I looked at her, not with anger, but just weariness. I don't need apologies, I said, my voice flat. I just need honesty. You can think what you want, but I'm not going to explain myself to anyone who doesn't ask the right questions. There was a beat of silence, and I felt the weight of it. Rachel had never expected that answer. She'd probably thought I was waiting for her to apologize, to smooth things over. But I didn't need that anymore. Not from her, not from anyone. Aunt Liz, surprisingly, let out a little chuckle, a sound of recognition more than amusement. I always suspected you were doing well, she said, eyes twinkling, but I have to admit, watching everyone here eat their words, that has been worth the price of admission. I gave her a small, almost amused smile. Well, I hope you all learned something today. Mark shifted in his seat, still uncomfortable, but less confrontational now. His face was still a little red, and he avoided looking directly at me. I let out a breath, the tension in my chest loosening. I wasn't here to pick at old wounds or prove anything. I was just done with their assumptions. You know, I said, looking around the table at each of them. Maybe we all need to stop assuming things about each other. Maybe instead of trying to figure out who's doing better or worse, we should actually talk. Real conversations, for once. Aunt Liz, always quick on her feet, raised an eyebrow but didn't say anything. Mark just nodded stiffly, like he didn't know what else to do. And Rachel looked at me differently now. I could see it in her eyes. The shift wasn't just about money or success anymore, it was about something else, something deeper. But I didn't need to wait for them to catch up. I had already moved past them. I was already beyond their assumptions. The silence that had settled over the table started to shift. For the first time, they were actually listening to me, like they were finally seeing the person I'd become, not the one they thought I was. It felt strange, but in a good way. Mark cleared his throat, looking at me with a new kind of interest. So, you said your company deals with logistics? What does that even look like? I sat up straighter, a small smile tugging at my lips. For the first time all afternoon, they were asking the questions I'd been waiting to answer. Real questions. Yeah, we automate logistics for international shipping. We build systems to streamline everything from inventory management to supply chain visibility. We make it easier for companies to move goods across borders without the headaches. Rachel nodded, her eyes widening. That sounds complicated. It is, I said, leaning forward. A lot of industries still operate like it's the 90s. Manual processes, a ton of paperwork. We come in, implement cloud-based solutions, and suddenly they're running more efficiently than they ever thought possible. Aunt Liz's eyebrows lifted, and she turned her attention fully to me. So, you're working with major companies then? Yeah, we've got clients in manufacturing, retail, and even food production. The more traditional industries are usually the toughest to break into, but once we show them how much money they're leaving on the table by not automating, they're all in. Mark leaned back, rubbing his chin. Huh, and that's all tech stuff? I'm assuming there's a lot of money in that? I couldn't help but grin. There's a lot of money, yeah. But the real challenge is the mindset. It's not just about selling a product, it's about convincing companies to change the way they've been doing business for decades. Some are easier to work with than others. Rachel looked visibly impressed now, her previous wariness gone. That's actually kind of cool, she said, genuinely interested. I had no idea it was that complex. I'm guessing you thought it was all just coding and startups, I teased lightly, giving her a small wink. She smiled back, her expression softening. Yeah, a little. Aunt Liz, always one to get to the point, didn't miss a beat. You know, my husband's business could probably use something like that. It's a logistics company, and I'm sure they could use help automating some of their processes. I paused for a second, considering her words. I can have someone from the partnerships team reach out, see if it's a good fit. Mark glanced at Aunt Liz, raising an eyebrow. You'd actually consider that? Sure, I said with a shrug. If it makes sense for both sides. It's all about whether the company's ready for the kind of changes we're talking about. Rachel looked at me, still processing everything I'd said. So, you didn't just stumble into all of this? I shook my head, smiling. Number. Took years of hard work. A lot of late nights, but it's paying off. Aunt Liz, who had been a little quiet since her earlier surprise, looked around the table at everyone, clearly enjoying the shift in the conversation. Well, I'll be damned. I think we've been doing this all wrong, huh? She said with a laugh. This is a real conversation, not just the usual small talk about cruises and charity galas. Mark chuckled, shaking his head. I guess we've all got some catching up to do. It felt good, not in a smug way, but in a way that finally made the conversation feel real. No more pretending, no more acting like I was just the quirky cousin. We were finally talking about something that mattered. The lunch wrapped up with actual conversation, not the usual rehearsed nonsense about vacations or home renovations. We talked about work, challenges, future plans. Aunt Liz asked about expanding into new markets, and Mark asked more about how we managed client relationships. I even found myself asking questions about their businesses, showing interest for the first time in a long time. It was different. It was real. And it felt like the first step toward something new. Maybe not just for me, but for all of us. As we finished dessert, Aunt Liz raised her glass, her eyes gleaming. To new beginnings, she said, a smile tugging at her lips. To new beginnings, I echoed, clinking my glass with hers. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we weren't just family. We were finally starting to see each other for who we really were. 3 months later, I was standing in the middle of the newly renovated Marina Club, looking around at the sleek modern design. The old wood-paneled walls had been replaced with smart glass, the floors now gleamed with polished stone, and the lighting adjusted itself automatically, depending on the time of day. It didn't look anything like the place it had been before. It looked like something out of a high-end magazine, and it was mine. I stood at the center of the room, surrounded by my family, not pushed to the edge of the table this time. No, today, I was the one sitting at the head. I had made this space what it was. This was my moment, and everyone could see it now. Rachel, who had been unusually quiet at the last family gathering, leaned over toward me with a half smile. You know, after our talk a few months ago, I decided to take some business courses, she said, the excitement in her voice evident. I figured if you could do it, why couldn't I? I raised an eyebrow, surprised but genuinely pleased. That's great, Rachel. I'm glad to hear it. She smiled, then paused, clearly excited to tell me more. I've been learning about everything from financials to strategy. It's been eye-opening. I nodded, feeling a little proud. She wasn't just following the old script of charity dinners and family gossip anymore. She was taking steps to build her own future. Mark, who had been standing nearby, overheard and cut in. Speaking of business, I've been looking at some potential investments, he said, almost casually. What do you think about the tech market right now? Specifically, AI and machine learning. I felt my pulse pick up a little. He was actually asking me for advice. AI's huge right now, I said, keeping it simple. The applications for automation are growing in every industry. But if you're thinking about diving in, make sure you understand the long-term commitments. It's a space where you need the right partnerships, solid infrastructure, and patience. Mark nodded, but his eyes were more focused than I'd ever seen them. He was listening, really listening. Aunt Liz, who had been chatting with a few of her friends, turned toward me with a proud grin. Let me introduce you to my friend Marla, she said. She's been dying to meet the person who turned this place around. I glanced over, giving Marla a polite smile, but the way Aunt Liz spoke, introducing me as if I were some celebrity, made me feel a little self-conscious. This is the owner of the Marina Club, Aunt Liz said with a flourish, like I had just won some major award. She's the one who saved it. I nodded, giving Marla a firm handshake, but Aunt Liz's pride didn't go unnoticed. It wasn't just about the club anymore, it was about the shift in the family's perception of me. They were finally seeing what I had built, not just the property or the company, but my place in this family, and it felt good. Damn good. After a while, I made my way toward Aunt Liz, who was sitting quietly in one of the lounge chairs, watching everyone else mingle. You look like you're enjoying this, I said, sitting down beside her. She looked at me with a smile that softened her usual sharpness. I am, she said quietly. I've been proud of you from the beginning, but watching you bring everyone together like this, it's something else. I didn't know what to say. Words seemed unnecessary. She leaned in slightly, lowering her voice. Thank you, not just for saving the club, but for doing it in a way that brought the family together differently. You've changed things, and I couldn't be more proud of you. Her words landed heavier than I expected, stirring something deep inside me. I didn't just want their respect. I wanted to change the dynamic, to show them that it was possible to build something from nothing without playing by their rules. And now, here we were. You've always been a fighter, Liz, I said, smiling softly. I think it's just rubbed off on me. She laughed, but her eyes sparkled. Maybe, but you did the work, and you did it your way. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I looked around the room at my family, talking, laughing, making real conversation for the first time in forever. The tables were full of life, not just empty words. The shift was real. The change wasn't just in the club. It was in all of us. And maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of something new for all of us. As dessert was served, Aunt Liz stood up, glass in hand, and the room quieted. Her eyes swept over the table, over all of us. There was no smugness, no sarcasm, just pride. Real pride. To new beginnings, she said, her voice ringing out, not just for this family, but for all of us. To change, to growth, and to the strength it took to get here. I felt a lump form in my throat, but I swallowed it down. I met her eyes across the table, and in that moment, it wasn't about who had more or who had built what. It was about something deeper, a recognition of what had shifted, not just in me, but in all of us. As we all clinked glasses, I looked around. I wasn't just the quiet cousin anymore. I wasn't on the sidelines or pushed to the edge of the table. People leaned in when I spoke now. They asked questions, not just out of politeness, but with real curiosity. For the first time, I felt like I was seen. The Marina Club thrived, memberships were up, Events were booking out, and the digital services we'd implemented were making waves. I had turned this place into something that wasn't just a family legacy, but a forward thinking business, something everyone could be proud of. And I thought about that afternoon in the powder room, the laughter, the mocking, the way they had dismissed me, assumed I was still figuring things out. I hadn't said anything that day. I hadn't needed to, because now nobody stepped inside without my knowledge. The whole place, from the docks to the restaurant to the digital systems running behind the scenes, it was mine. And I didn't need to shout it out loud. I didn't need to prove anything anymore. Success didn't need to be loud or flashy. It just needed to show up, take its seat, and let everything else fall into place. And it had.